You are currently a walking, talking miracle of three-dimensional geometry, though you rarely take the time to appreciate the math keeping your heart beating. At your most fundamental level, you are not a soul or a mind, but a frantic, ongoing exercise in biological origami. Every function your body performs, from the way you process a thought to the way you digest a sandwich, depends entirely on the specific shape of proteins. These long chains of amino acids must fold themselves into precise, hauntingly complex structures to work. If the fold is correct, you live and breathe and wonder about the stars. If the fold is wrong, the machinery of life does not just stop. Sometimes it turns into a weapon that targets the very foundation of your existence. We like to think of death as something that comes from the outside, like a predator's teeth or a microscopic invader with its own selfish DNA. We understand viruses and bacteria because they have an agenda. They want to eat, they want to reproduce, and they want to survive. But there is a shadow moving through the tall grass of our biology that has no agenda, no genome, and no heartbeat. It is a silent, structural error that behaves like a predatory idea, spreading through your brain by doing nothing more than being the wrong shape. This is the prion, a biological glitch so profound that it challenges our definition of what it means to be alive. You are about to realize that your entire life is held together by a series of folds that can be undone by a single, stubborn piece of bad paper. The story of your life is written in the language of proteins, which are the primary building blocks of every cell in your body. When your DNA sends out instructions, it is not sending out a finished product. It is sending out a long, limp string of chemical pearls called amino acids. To become useful, these strings must fold themselves into a highly specific 3D architecture within microseconds. This process is so complex that if a supercomputer tried to calculate every possible way a single protein could fold, it would take longer than the age of the universe to find the right one. Yet, your body does this trillions of times a day with staggering accuracy, creating the enzymes and structures that keep the lights on in your head. It is a process governed by the laws of thermodynamics, where the protein seeks its most stable, low-energy state to function. The horror begins when we realize how narrow the margin for error truly is in this geometric lottery. Most of the time, when a protein misfolds, your cellular trash cans, the proteasomes, simply break it down and recycle the parts. It is a self-correcting system that has worked for billions of years of evolution, ensuring that the broken shapes do not gum up the works. However, there's a specific protein in your brain called PRP, the function of which we still do not fully understand, that possesses a terrifying hidden potential. Under the right circumstances, this protein can fold into a shape that is not just broken, but indestructible and infectious. This is not an infection in the way we usually think about it. It is a structural corruption that turns your own molecular stability against you. You have to understand that a prion is not a thing in the way a cell is a thing. It is more like a piece of bad advice that your body not stop following. When a healthy protein is folded, it usually takes the shape of elegant, spring-like coils called alpha helices. But a prion is a version of that same protein that has collapsed into flat, jagged sheets called beta sheets. These sheets are incredibly stable. So stable, in fact, that the body's natural cleaning crews cannot break them apart or melt them down. They are the molecular equivalent of a diamond hard, not in a sea of soft silk. Even more disturbing is the fact that these misfolded shapes are currently capable of surviving temperatures that would turn most biological matter into ash. This brings us to the most chilling aspect of the prion's nature. It is a template for disaster. When a misfolded prion protein bumps into a healthy, normally folded protein of the same type, it does not eat it or infect it with a virus. Instead, it acts like a physical mold, forcing the healthy protein to snap out of its coil and flatten into a jagged beta sheet. It is a chain reaction of bad geometry, a slow-motion car crash at the molecular level where every car that hits the pileup becomes part of the wall that causes the next crash. It is a biological fire that does not need oxygen or fuel. It only needs the presence of your own healthy body to keep spreading. This conversion process is relentless and irreversible, turning your once functional brain tissue into a growing mass of useless, toxic sludge. We're used to thinking of disease as a battle between us and them, but with prion, the enemy is literally a mirror image of ourselves. There is no foreign genetic material to detect, no inflammatory response to alert the immune system, and no metabolic process to interrupt with drugs. Your body does not even know it's under attack because the prion are made of the exact same amino acids as your healthy proteins. They are invisible to your white blood cells, moving through your nervous system like a ghost through a wall. This is why the incubation period is so haunting. You could be carrying the seed of your own destruction for 30 years without a single sniffle. By the time the first symptom appears, the structural integrity of your mind has already been compromised beyond repair. The terrifying reality is that a prion is essentially dead in the most absolute sense, which makes it impossible to kill. UCA not kill something that has no metabolism, no respiration, and no reproductive cycle. If you soak a prion in concentrated bleach, it often survives. If you blast it with radiation that would shred the DNA of any known bacteria, it remains perfectly intact. Scientists have found that even after being baked in an oven at 600 degrees Celsius, the charred remains of prion-infected tissue can still transmit the disease. We're dealing with a form of biological information that is more durable than the organisms it inhabits. It is a glitch in the matrix of life that, once triggered, cannot be deleted or patched out of the system. This corruption is not a localized event. It is a systemic takeover of your neurological architecture. As the prion aggregate, they form long, rope-like fibers called amyloid plaques that physically tear through the delicate fabric of your neurons. Your brain, which is normally a dense, interconnected web of electric signals, begins to develop literal holes. Under a microscope, the brain of a prion victim looks like a kitchen sponge, full of empty spaces where life used to be. This is why these diseases are called spongiform encephalopathies. Your identity, your memories, and your ability to breathe are all slowly dissolved as your brain turns into a porous, useless block of protein. Consider the fact that we are currently living in a world where these zombie proteins are quietly accumulating in the environment. Because they are so resistant to decay, they can persist in the soil for decades, waiting for a host to graze upon the wrong patch of grass. They can cling to the surface of medical instruments, surviving standard sterilization cycles that would leave any other pathogen neutralized. We have built a civilization based on the assumption that biology is a fragile thing that can be washed away with soap and heat. Prion prove that this is a lie, showing us that there are certain shapes of matter that are far more permanent than the fragile lives they inhabit. As we look deeper into the history of these diseases, we find that the most efficient way to spread this geometric curse is through the act of consumption. When one organism eats the nervous system of another, it provides a direct highway for these misfolded proteins to find a new home. This is not just a matter of hygiene. It is a fundamental violation of the biological distance that usually protects species from one another. We have spent centuries industrializing our food systems and our medical practices, inadvertently creating the perfect conditions for a protein-based apocalypse. We have turned the act of living into a game of Russian roulette, where the bullet is a microscopic fold of paper. You're currently walking around with a brain full of proteins that are perfectly shaped for now. But the sheer stability of the prion shape suggests that our healthy state is actually the unstable one. We're like a ball balanced precariously on the tip of a mountain, while the prion is the ball resting at the very bottom of the valley. It is the more natural state for these proteins to be in, and it only takes one accidental nudge to send us tumbling down into the dark. We are not the masters of our own biology. We are merely temporary witnesses to a chemical process that prefers to be broken. The most frightening thought is not that you might catch a prion, but that your own body might decide to start folding itself into a coffin from the inside out. To understand how this internal collapse begins, we have to look back at a time when we first realized that death could be swallowed. In the 1950s, in the humid, isolated highlands of Papua New Guinea, the four people were being decimated by a localized plague they called kuru, or the trembling. It started with a slight wobble in the gait, a loss of balance that seemed almost drunk, but it quickly spiraled into a total loss of motor control. Within months, victims would lose the ability to sit up or speak, often descending into fits of eerie, uncontrollable laughter that gave the disease its haunting nickname, the Laughing Death. The village elders believed it was a curse brought on by sorcery, a dark magic that was hollowing out their kin from the inside. They were more right than they could have possibly imagined, though the sorcery was not found in a spell, but in a ritual of profound love and grief. The four practiced a form of funerary cannibalism, a way of honoring the dead by incorporating their physical essence into the living. When a family member died, it was the duty of the women and children to dismantle the body and consume the remains so that the soul of the deceased would not be left to rot in the cold ground. While the men typically ate the muscle, the women and children were given the brain, which they cooked into a gray, gelatinous broth. This act of devotion was, in reality, a massive biological delivery system for a single, misfolded protein that had likely appeared in one individual as a random mutation decades earlier. By eating the brain of the deceased, they were literally spoon-feeding themselves the very geometry of their own destruction. It is a chilling reminder that the same industrial-scale recycling of biology is happening today in the hidden corners of our global food supply. This was the first time modern science witnessed the transmission of a disease that had no genetic signature, yet it took decades to realize that this was not just a jungle fever. The kuru epidemic eventually faded once the ritual was banned, but the lesson it taught us was terrifyingly simple. If you eat your own kind, you risk catching their most stable errors. We think of ourselves as evolved and civilized, far removed from the primitive rituals of the four, but our modern economy is built on a different kind of cannibalism. We have replaced the ritual fire with a rendering plant, and the motive of love with the motive of profit. This transition from the sacred to the industrial set the stage for a much larger, much more public horror that would eventually grip the entire Western world. In the 1980s and 90s, the United Kingdom became the epicenter of a biological disaster that we now know as mad cow disease or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE. To save money on protein-rich feed, the agricultural industry began a practice that mirrored the four ritual on a massive, mechanical scale. They took the leftovers of the slaughterhouse, the bones, the offal, and the brains of cows, and ground them into a dry, brown powder called meat and bone meal. This powder was then fed back to other cows, turning natural herbivores into forced cannibals for the sake of efficiency. It was a closed-loop system of biological corruption that allowed a single misfolded protein to be amplified millions of times across the entire country. You might find it unsettling to realize that the steak on your plate today is the product of a system that once thought it could cheat the laws of biology without consequence. The result was a slow-motion catastrophe that saw hundreds of thousands of cattle lose their minds, stumbling and twitching in the mud before being dragged to the incinerator. But the horror did not stop at the fence of the farm. It jumped the species barrier. Humans who ate the contaminated beef began to develop a new, aggressive form of the disease called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, VCJD. Young, healthy people in their 20s suddenly found themselves suffering from the same trembling and cognitive collapse that had once haunted the Papua New Guinea highlands. We had taken a rare, localized glitch and turned it into an industrial product, proving that the corrupted message of a prion does not care if it is in a human brain or a bovine one. The shape is the message, and the message is universal. We often tell ourselves that we fix the problem by banning these feeding practices, but prion are not so easily evicted from our world. They are currently lurking in the soil of pastures and the runoff of slaughterhouses, waiting for a new host to stumble upon them. Because they do not decay like bacteria or viruses, they can remain infectious in the environment for decades, surviving through rain, frost, and searing heat. This brings us to a reality that is even more intimate and disturbing than the food we eat. We have to face the fact that the very tools we use to save lives in our modern hospitals might be the most effective vectors for this indestructible death. If you go into a hospital for a routine surgery, you trust that the instruments being used on you are sterile. We have perfected the art of killing life. We use autoclaves that blast tools with high-pressure steam at temperatures that melt the protective coatings of any known virus. We use harsh chemicals, radiation, and intense heat to ensure that no bacteria can survive on a scalpel or a needle. But a prion is not a living thing, and it does not respond to the protocols of life. To a prion, a standard medical autoclave is nothing more than a warm bath. It does not just survive the process. It can actually become more tightly bound to the stainless steel surface of the instrument, forming a molecular bond that is nearly impossible to break. This has led to a nightmare scenario known as iatrogenic CJD, where the disease is transmitted through medical procedures. In the past, people were infected through contaminated human growth hormones or through the transplantation of brain tissue from donors who did not even know they were sick. Even more terrifying are the cases where patients contracted the disease from surgical electrodes that had been used on a previous victim and then sterilized according to every modern standard. The prion sat on that metal surface, a microscopic diamond of doom, waiting to be pressed into the brain of the next unsuspecting person. Every time you enter a surgical suite, you're stepping into a space where the ghosts of past patients might still be clinging to the tools of the trade. The tenacity of these proteins on metal surfaces is a problem that keeps neurosurgeons awake at night, or at least it should. There is no simple way to detect a prion on a scalpel, and there is no way to kill it without essentially destroying the tool itself. Some hospitals have been forced to incinerate millions of dollars worth of equipment after discovering that a single patient with a prion disease had been in the operating room. But for every case we catch, how many go unnoticed? We are operating in the dark, using tools that might carry a death sentence from a patient who died 20 years ago, all because we cannot scrub a shape off a piece of steel. This is not just a theoretical risk. It is a fundamental flaw in our ability to maintain a clean biological slate. The most cynical part of this reality is that our bodies are perfectly designed to receive these corrupted shapes. Our nervous systems are like a series of interconnected highways, and the prion is a hitchhiker that knows all the back roads. Once it enters your body, whether through a burger, a surgical tool, or a hormone injection, it does not need to do anything spectacular to win. It just needs to wait. It moves slowly, traveling up the nerves from the gut or the skin until it reaches the sanctuary of the brain. Once there, it begins the slow process of turning your healthy proteins into copies of itself. A silent takeover that produces no fever, no swelling, and no warning. We are currently living through a massive, uncontrolled experiment in biological persistence. Thousands of people in the UK and across Europe are believed to be silent carriers of the prion that causes VCJD, and we have no way of knowing who they are. Because the incubation period can last for 30, 40, or even 50 years, the burger you ate in 1995 could be the very thing that dissolves your mind in 2045. We are walking around with a ticking time bomb in our heads, a geometric error that is currently, at this very second, slowly seeking out its next healthy protein to fold into a grave. The gap between the moment of infection and the moment of collapse is so wide that we have lost the ability to connect the cause with the effect, leaving us to wonder which of our past choices has already sealed our fate, slowly seeking out its next healthy protein to fold into a grave. This silent migration is not restricted to the sterile hallways of a hospital or the isolated rituals of a remote tribe. It is currently playing out across the vast, rolling forests of North America in what scientists have dubbed the zombie deer disease. Chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is a prion infection that has taken root in deer, elk, and moose populations with a tenacity that defies our best efforts at containment. Unlike the madness that struck the cattle of Europe, this version of the geometric curse does not require a centralized rendering plant to spread. It has found a way to turn the very environment into a permanent reservoir of infection, ensuring that the ground itself becomes a medium for the transmission of death. The way CWD moves through a forest is a masterclass in biological persistence that should make your skin crawl. An infected deer does not just carry the prion in its brain. It sheds them in its saliva, its urine, and its feces, leaving a trail of indestructible bad folds everywhere it goes. These proteins do not simply wash away with the rain or break down in the sun. They bind to the clay and minerals in the soil, creating a microscopic minefield that can stay active for decades. When a healthy deer comes along to graze on a patch of grass, it is not just eating nutrients. It is vacuuming up the structural errors left behind by a ghost that died years ago. We are witnessing the terraforming of the natural world into a space that is fundamentally hostile to the current architecture of life. What makes this sleeping apocalypse so unsettling is the way the prion interact with the flora of these regions. Recent studies have shown that plants can actually take up these misfolded proteins through their root systems, incorporating the prion into their leaves and stems. This means that even if you removed every single infected animal from the woods, the very grass and trees would remain contaminated, acting as silent sentinels for a disease that cannot be killed. It is a closed loop of corruption that does not need a laboratory to escape or a virus to mutate. It is a natural drift toward a more stable, more stagnant form of matter that is slowly replacing the vibrant, flexible geometry of living things with something hard and unyielding. We have to ask ourselves how long the species barrier will hold before these zombie proteins find a way into our own nervous systems. While there has not yet been a confirmed case of CWD jumping directly to humans, the history of mad cow disease tells us that we are often the last to know when the barrier has been breached. Laboratory experiments have already shown that CWD prion can convert human proteins in a test tube, suggesting that the only thing standing between us and a new epidemic is a slight difference in molecular fit. Every hunter who handles a carcass and every hiker who kicks up dust in an infected forest is participating in a high-stakes game of biological chance. We are surrounded by a form of life that is waiting for one random, statistical fluke to turn our brains into the next available fuel source. This brings us to a realization that is far more terrifying than the prospect of a new disease. It forces us to look in the mirror and see what we actually are. We like to imagine that there is a spark of life, a soul, or a consciousness that exists independently of the wet, heavy machinery of ourselves. But prion proved that the difference between a thinking, feeling human and a pile of useless sludge is nothing more than the way a few pieces of biological paper are folded. You are not a spirit inhabiting a body. You are a specific, fragile arrangement of matter that is currently winning a war against the laws of physics. The moment your proteins decide to seek a lower energy state, the you that thinks these thoughts will simply vanish, replaced by a more stable version of your own atoms that no longer cares about being alive. If a single misfolded protein can enter your brain and systematically delete your personality, your memories, and your motor functions, then what exactly are you? We are a house of cards built on the assumption that our biology will always choose the most difficult path, the path of high energy, functional complexity. But the prion is the universe's way of reminding us that the easy path is the path of the fold. It is the biological equivalent of water running downhill. Once the process starts, it is impossible to push it back up. Your identity is a temporary glitch in the thermodynamic slide towards stasis, a brief moment where matter has been tricked into believing it is something more than just a shape. The existential, awe we feel when looking at the stars is nothing compared to the biological dread of looking at a protein. We are held together by a series of chemical handshakes that are so precise and so delicate that it is a miracle we survive a single day. Every time a protein folds in your body, it is a roll of the dice, a gamble that the geometry will remain in our favor for just one more second. We are not the masters of this machine. We are the passengers of a vehicle that is slowly, inevitably, shaking itself apart. The prion is just a preview of the end, a version of death that does not wait for the heart to stop, but starts by unmaking the very foundation of the mind. As we move forward into a future where these indestructible shapes are becoming more common in our food, our soil, and our hospitals, we have to accept our own vulnerability. We have spent centuries trying to conquer the world of microbes, only to find that the ultimate threat is a piece of ourselves that has forgotten how to behave. There is no vaccine for a shape, no antibiotic for a fold, and no cure for the truth of our own fragility. We are just a collection of shapes that can be unfolded at any moment, and the universe is full of templates waiting to show us how it is done. Our existence is a brief, beautiful error in a world that is slowly returning to a state of perfect, jagged sheets. When you finally close your eyes for the last time, it would not be because a spirit has left your body or because a clock has run out of time. It will be because the geometry of your existence has finally reached its most stable configuration. You will be refolded into the earth, your proteins finally resting in the same low-energy state as the prion that haunted your nightmares. The laughing death and the trembling are just the sounds of the machinery breaking down as it realizes that being alive was always the most exhausting thing it could possibly do. In the end, we do not die because we stop. We die because we finally become a shape that is too perfect to keep moving. You are a miracle of origami, but the paper is getting tired. Every breath you take is a temporary reprieve from the inevitable collapse of your own structure. We are walking, talking accidents of three-dimensional math, and the world is full of knives disguised as paper. Sleep well, knowing that your brain is currently a masterpiece of delicate coils, and hope that it stays that way. Because once the first sheet flattens, the rest of the book is already written. Death is not an end. It is just a different way of being folded.